He didn't shout. He didn't fight. He just walked calm, deliberate into the heart of Savannah with a baby stroller full of proof and a plan to expose everything. They thought he was just another black man in the wrong place. What they didn't know was that every step was a trap. Silent, legal, and irreversible. This wasn't protest. This was precision. And when the city tried to silence him, they triggered a reckoning they'll never forget. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. Jeremiah Carter never expected the morning sun to burn with such quiet malice. It was the kind of light that made everything look a little too perfect. A veil of peace stretched thin over something waiting to snap. Savannah, Georgia, with its cobblestone streets and moss-draped oaks, whispered with old stories. But this one was new. And Jeremiah, a large black man in his mid-40s wearing a weathered hoodie and pushing a baby stroller, was about to become the center of it. To the casual eye, there was nothing remarkable about him. His broad shoulders carried no threat. His slow, deliberate steps held no urgency. He was humming low, the soft kind of tune only fathers hum when trying to calm a child or themselves. The stroller he pushed didn't hold a baby. It held a stack of documents neatly bound in a worn leather folio. A camera lens, barely visible, peeked through the mesh at the back. And in his jacket pocket was a handwritten note. Start at Forsyth. Let the truth follow. The square was nearly empty. Only a few joggers and an elderly couple feeding squirrels were nearby. But eyes, the kind that watch from behind curtains, and cell phone screens began to narrow. He knew they would. He'd planned for it. 3 blocks away, Officer Tyler Barnes leaned against his cruiser, sipping lukewarm coffee and scrolling through his feed. The radio crackled with static until dispatch mentioned a suspicious large male pushing a stroller alone through Forsyth Park. Barnes sighed, tossed the cup aside, and turned the ignition. The weight of assumption settled in his chest like it always did, except this time it would crush more than just perception. Jeremiah reached the fountain and paused. He adjusted the stroller and stood still, looking up at the Spanish moss swaying above. He didn't have long. The setup had begun 2 weeks ago when his neighbor's teenage son was tackled in front of their building for matching a vague description. Jeremiah watched the boy cry in his mother's arms, humiliated but lucky to be alive. That night, something old inside Jeremiah woke up something from before his quiet desk job, before the belly grew soft and the silence heavy. He used to be an analyst. Pentagon, clearance, covert ops, digital surveillance. That life ended years ago, but not the skills. He pulled in favors, set up angles, coded failsafes. He didn't want revenge. He wanted evidence. And more than that, he wanted to expose how easily a man like him could be judged for the curve of his body and the color of his skin. Officer Barnes parked roughly and stepped out, resting his hand on his belt. "Sir, you all right there?" Jeremiah didn't flinch. He turned slowly. "Beautiful morning, isn't it? We got a call. Said someone matching your description was acting suspicious. Walking through a park. Mind if I ask what's in the stroller?" "You can ask," Jeremiah said calmly, "but I'd like to know what law I'm suspected of breaking before we go down that road." Barnes shifted. Something in Jeremiah's tone wasn't defiant. It was deliberate. He gestured for backup. Across the square, 2 more officers began closing in. Inside the stroller, the lens recorded. Audio streamed live. To 3 encrypted servers, 1 local, 1 out of state, 1 overseas. The confrontation escalated quickly, as they so often do when fear wears a badge and dignity refuses to kneel. Barnes reached forward. Jeremiah took a half step back. A hand touched the stroller. "I wouldn't," Jeremiah said, voice low, controlled. "What's in there?" "Proof." The word hung in the air like a gunshot. Behind it, silence, then movement. A bystander began filming. Another crossed the street. Then, without warning, Barnes grabbed Jeremiah's arm. The camera in the stroller caught everything. The struggle, the twist, the handcuffs snapped on too tight. Jeremiah's face, calm but not surprised. He whispered to no one in particular, "It begins." 20 minutes later, downtown buzzed with a new headline. "Local man detained without cause, video emerges of possible police overreach." What they didn't know, what the cops hadn't realized, was that every step, every moment, every second had been orchestrated. And the trap, though silent, had now been triggered. Not out of hate, not for glory, but because sometimes you have to make people uncomfortable to make them finally see. And Jeremiah Carter was just getting started. The heat that draped over Savannah that afternoon was thick, sticky like molasses, and heavy with anticipation. River Street bustled, as it always did, tourists snapping photos of moss-draped oaks, families ordering pralines, and jazz musicians filling the air with a lazy, beautiful hum. But none of them noticed the tension building around Harold Jennings, a large black man in a neatly pressed blue linen shirt and dark slacks, whose presence near the historic district had, for reasons known only to ignorance, begun to draw unwanted eyes. Harold had returned to Savannah not for vacation or nostalgia, but for justice. He had invested in the city before it knew his name, owned buildings when banks laughed at his proposals. Today, he was walking toward a meeting that would finally turn the tide on corrupt dealings in the city's private security contracts. What he didn't expect was the crude interruption on the cobbled edge of River Street. 2 uniformed officers, Officer Daltrey and Officer Monroe, spotted Harold near the waterfront pavilion. Their radios crackled, but it wasn't an emergency call that prompted their action. It was a glance. A glance informed not by reason, but by prejudice. A large black man standing still, hands in pockets, suspicion was all they needed. All. "Sir, we need to see some ID." Officer Daltrey demanded, voice already clipped. Harold turned calm and composed. "Is there a problem, officer?" "Didn't say there was, but we're asking you to cooperate." Harold reached into his pocket slowly and handed over a slim leather wallet. His license was current. His name, Harold Jennings. Business owner, taxpayer, philanthropist. But that didn't stop Monroe from stepping closer, hand on holster scanning Harold like he was reading an unsolved crime. A crowd began to gather. A street performer fell quiet. Tourists slowed their pace, but no one said anything. Not yet. Daltrey scoffed. "You've been hanging around too long, Jennings. Loitering is a charge down here." Harold raised an eyebrow. "I'm headed to a meeting in the chamber building. I have a key to the front door." "You always talk slick, huh?" Monroe muttered, now visibly agitated. The encounter turned. Fast. Daltrey grabbed Harold's arm, twisting it behind his back. "We're taking you in for further questioning." Harold didn't resist. He'd planned for this. Across the street, a black SUV's passenger door opened. A young woman in a charcoal suit and mirrored sunglasses stepped out and tapped her phone. In seconds, a live stream began quietly capturing the chaos. Her name was Maya Trenton Harold's legal aid civil rights law graduate and the one person he trusted to document this day. The officers hadn't noticed her yet. They were too busy pressing Harold's chest against the brick wall, ignoring the mounting voices of disapproval that began to rise. "Why are you arresting him?" a man called out. "He didn't do anything," a woman shouted. But the officers barked back. "Back off, or get detained yourselves." Harold's voice was steady but low. "You're making a mistake, gentlemen." And then a second SUV pulled up. Two men in tailored suits emerged. One held a press badge. The other, a retired federal judge and Harold's silent partner in the redevelopment lawsuit that would rock Savannah's political structure to its core. They approached unbothered, stepping right into the scene. Daltrey turned. "This doesn't concern you." The judge flashed a badge. "It does now." A beat of silence passed. Officer Monroe's eyes flicked to the badge, to the small cluster of phones filming them, and to the murmuring crowd that had now grown to dozens. He loosened his grip. Daltrey, however, remained defiant. "We have authority here." The judge stepped closer. "And you just used it to assault a private citizen on camera. That's obstruction of justice at minimum. This man is not only innocent, he's the lead complainant in a federal corruption case." Whispers erupted. Daltrey's face fell. Harold stood upright. His shirt rumpled, his pride intact. "You thought I'd come alone?" he asked quietly. The SUV doors opened again. A third man emerged, not in a suit, not a lawyer. He wore the unmistakable lapel pin of the Department of Justice. The agents moved forward, and for the first time, Officer Daltrey stepped back. Maya stepped forward, still recording. "Everything has been documented, including the moment you assumed a black man in a nice shirt didn't belong on River Street." The crowd, once uncertain, now began to understand. "A little girl," asked her mother, "Is he in trouble?" The mother shook her head. "No, baby. He's fixing the trouble." Harold didn't smile. Not yet. He looked over his shoulder at the crowd, at the people now pulling out phones, not out of curiosity, but to record truth, to remember what justice looked like when it walked, not ran into battle. Then he turned to the officers. "You have two choices. Let me go now and apologize, or wait for the paperwork that ends your careers." Officer Monroe slowly lowered his hands. Daltrey clenched his jaw, but he knew. This wasn't their moment anymore. Harold stepped forward, brushing dust from his shoulder. He looked not at them, but at the people, those who had stayed silent, those who had spoken, those who had filmed. "The truth always walks quietly," he said, "until it's time to speak." And with that, he turned and walked away toward the chamber building, his aide, and the moment that would ignite everything. Harold Jennings walked through the grand marble entrance of the chamber building like a man who had just set off the first tremor of an earthquake. His linen shirt still creased from the encounter outside, but he carried himself as if the wrinkles told a deeper truth, not of shame, but survival. Maya Trenton followed a few steps behind her phone, off now, her face unreadable. She knew better than anyone that what had just occurred on River Street was more than a confrontation. It was part of the strategy. Weeks ago, Harold had predicted that city officials and their cronies in uniform would resist his return. He had sensed it. The sudden delays in permit approvals, the quiet denial of his requests for meeting space The whispers about that big man thinking he can come back here and change things. But he didn't come unprepared. Inside the chamber boardroom, 3 people were already waiting. Judge Samuel Reed, longtime ally and reluctant crusader. Tanya Liu, an investigative journalist for the Atlanta Observer, with a folder thick with statements and footage. And Daryl Mitchell Harold's closest friend and former Army intelligence officer, now turned community strategist. "Nice entrance," Daryl quipped, handing Harold a bottle of water. "They gave me the red carpet," Harold replied, taking a seat at the head of the table. Maya laid her phone on the table, the screen already uploading the River Street footage to a secure cloud server. "We have 6 angles. Crowd clips my video, and 2 security cameras from storefronts across the street." Tanya nodded. "The moment Officer Daltrey put his hands on you is clear. His body language, his tone. We won't need narration." Harold leaned forward, folding his hands. "Good. Because this isn't just about them. This is about the system that lets men like them believe their bias is protocol." Judge Reed spoke, his voice slow, careful. "You understand what you're stepping into. This goes beyond misconduct. You're challenging decades of embedded corruption, business permits reserved for preferred partners, contract bids with no transparency, and officers incentivized to harass what they deem out of place. You're going to make enemies." Harold didn't blink. "I already did when I dared to walk back into this city with equity in mind." Daryl opened a manila folder and spread out a schematic map of River Street. "Phase 1 is exposure. We've got Tanya's article ready. It drops Monday. Front page. Phase 2 is policy submitting formal complaints to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Justice, and the ACLU. But Phase 3, he trailed off, tapping the map twice. Harold picked up where he left off. "Phase 3 is ownership." The room grew still. "I'm buying the entire block." Maya's brows lifted. Tanya sat back. Judge Reed's eyes narrowed. "You're serious," the judge said. "I always was." Over the last 6 months, Harold had worked quietly through proxies, acquiring neglected properties along River Street, old warehouses, a shuttered art gallery, 2 boarded-up shops that once belonged to black families, pushed out by rising rents and bureaucratic red tape. While the city blocked his permits, they didn't realize who the buyers were. Now, those purchases converged into one contiguous development plan, the Jennings Restoration Corridor. Tanya spoke first. "You're not just taking back space. You're redefining its story." "That's the goal," Harold said, "for every child who watches what happened today and thinks they have no place in these streets. For every parent who was told they didn't belong at their own kid's ceremony. We reclaim it all." The judge nodded slowly, his earlier caution replaced by respect. "But the opposition will dig in. They'll smear you. Play the angry black man card. Twist the narrative." "I'm counting on it," Harold replied, "because this time we have more than outrage, we have receipts." Maya flipped through her legal binder, laying out signed affidavits from former city workers' internal memos leaked by a whistleblower, and proof of unjust land seizures targeting low-income black residents. "This isn't just your fight anymore," she said. "It's a movement." Outside the boardroom window, the sound of bells from the Savannah Cathedral echoed faintly. It was a strange kind of peace, the kind that arrives before a storm, not chaos, but clarity. Harold stood. "Let them come for me. Let them accuse. Let them scramble. But when they do, we stay focused. No retaliation. No violence. Just truth layered, unshakable, undeniable." Tanya's voice was quiet now. You know you're setting a precedent. No, Harold replied. I'm setting a record. They began distributing assignments. Daryl would coordinate the community response team. Tanya would time the article's release with the first permit filing. Judge Reed would prepare a legal roadmap for both civil and criminal inquiries. And Maya, she would document everything. As the meeting wrapped, Daryl looked over at Harold. You planned all this. Even getting grabbed in public. I hoped it wouldn't come to that, Harold said. But I knew if it did, the whole world would see what we've been trying to say for years. He turned to the window, watching the traffic flow slowly over the cobblestone street below. Let them see. Let them watch what justice looks like when it doesn't flinch. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the storm building behind the glass. But the strategy had begun. And Harold Jennings was just getting started. The air in Savannah shifted. It wasn't the heat. Though the summer clung like a second skin, it was something heavier. An unease threading through the cobbled alleys and manicured streets like the city itself sensed it was standing on the edge of reckoning. Harold Jennings stood at the foot of the City Hall steps, framed against the historic dome behind him, the morning sun casting a long shadow at his feet. Reporters gathered below, some skeptical, others hungry. A few cameras were already rolling. Across the square, citizens gathered, young, old, black, white, curious, tense, alert. Most of them had seen the River Street footage. Most of them now knew the name Harold Jennings. And now he was speaking. I didn't come here to break Savannah. Harold began, voice steady. But I will break the silence that's protected the powerful for far too long. The words rang out with the precision of a sermon. Behind him, Maya Trenton stood at a modest podium, queuing up a large screen. It flashed open with images, permits denied, without cause, public contracts funneled to shell companies, incident reports stamped with falsehoods, and finally, the still frame of Officer Daltrey gripping Harold's shirt, frozen mid-assault. Gasps rippled through the crowd. We were told it was about public safety, Harold continued. But what happened to me wasn't about safety. It was about control. It was about fear, about a city afraid of a black man who owns land, speaks clearly, and doesn't ask for permission. The words hit like hammers. The camera shutters clicked in a flurry. He didn't flinch. For weeks, Harold and his team had quietly laid the groundwork, legal filings, community petitions, whistleblower testimonies. All the dots were now connected, but the true weight of this day wasn't in paperwork. It was in public declaration. Behind the scenes, the city officials were scrambling. The mayor's office had gone dark. Officer Daltrey had been suspended unofficially, of course, but no charges were filed. Internal Affairs had promised an independent review. It was the oldest trick in the book. Delay, deny, distract. But Harold didn't give them time. The screen now showed side-by-side footage, the River Street altercation, beside a quiet, nearly identical moment from 3 years prior, when a white developer was ushered past the same officers greeted with smiles. The same location, same rules, different skin. And the crowd saw it. That was the breaking point. A woman shouted from the back, "We've had enough." Then another, "He's telling the truth." The energy turned. No longer passive observers, the crowd leaned forward, hungry, awake. They weren't just listening. They were remembering. Every eviction, every crooked city deal, every time someone said, "That's just how things work here." Not anymore. Judge Reed stepped forward, holding up the first stamped document, a federal inquiry request backed by 2 civil rights organizations and signed by 3 congressional representatives. "This isn't symbolic," he announced. It's procedural. It's legal. It's real. Tanya Liu passed out copies of the full report to every reporter. 32 pages, footnoted, annotated with corroborating evidence and signed affidavits. The city could no longer hide behind speculation. The truth had weight now, pages of it. That's when the police cruiser arrived. Blue lights but no siren. It rolled slowly into the square, and out stepped Officer Daltrey. Not in uniform, civilian clothes, sleeves rolled up, jaw clenched. His eyes locked on Harold. A murmur spread through the crowd. The tension hit its peak. Harold didn't move. Daltrey walked closer, not aggressive, not yet, but with that tight posture of someone who still believed in his authority. Two officers followed behind him, younger, uncertain. Harold spoke first. "You shouldn't be here." Daltrey scoffed. "Neither should you." The crowd shifted uneasily. Cameras trained on them. Every breath felt like kindling. But Harold didn't raise his voice. "You put your hands on me in public," he said, "because you thought no one would stop you. But someone did. And more are watching now. You don't scare me. You don't silence me." Daltrey's jaw flexed. "You're a provocateur." "No," Harold replied calmly. "I'm a mirror. You don't like what you see." Behind Daltrey, the younger officer took a step back. He'd seen the video. He knew. Judge Reed moved between them, holding a hand up. "Officer Daltrey, this is now a legal matter. I advise you for your own sake to leave this space." For a moment, it looked like Daltrey might resist. Then he glanced around the cameras, the crowd, the eyes that no longer looked away. And he did something unexpected. He turned and walked. No apology, no acknowledgement, just retreat. But that retreat was enough. The crowd erupted not in chaos, but in affirmation. A clapping wave that began softly and then rose like thunder. Not just for Harold, but for every moment someone was dismissed, disrespected, and finally seen. Maya touched Harold's shoulder. "You just cracked the wall." "No," he said quietly. "We just made the first hole." And in that silence, after the applause, the city felt different. Less guarded, less blind, more ready. Because Harold Jennings hadn't just spoken truth, he made it undeniable. And the break in the system had just begun. By the time the courthouse bell chimed noon, the city of Savannah had already shifted in a way it would never fully return from. No ruling had been issued, no arrests made, but the people had rendered a different kind of justice, one not handed down from a bench, but risen from below it. Harold Jennings stood once more on the edge of Wright Square. The crowd dispersed, the cameras gone. But what lingered was louder than any gavel. It was memory. Memory of truth spoken where it wasn't welcomed. Memory of a man who did not flinch when faced with the weight of a system built to exclude him. Inside the municipal hall, a meeting was underway. Closed door, urgent, defensive. Harold was not invited, but he didn't need to be. He had already said everything that needed saying. He wasn't chasing retribution anymore. He was giving it shape. As he stood beneath the Spanish moss, swaying gently overhead, Maya approached, holding a folder filled with next steps. Civil litigation ethics, complaints, media follow-ups. But she knew better than to lead with paperwork. Instead, she said, "They're squirming." Harold gave a soft grunt. "Let them." He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the small, folded invitation he'd received weeks earlier, the one to the fundraiser that started it all. The one he'd shown to Officer Daltrey right before everything had come undone. It was crumpled, now worn thin at the creases. But he unfolded it once more, gazing at the typed words that seemed so harmless. At first, "Join us for a brighter Savannah." He chuckled under his breath. Brighter for who? Behind him, a young man no older than 20 hesitated before approaching. He wore a janitor's badge from City Service's nervousness in his stance. Mr. Jennings, he said, I saw what you did. My uncle works the docks. He always said you were the one who spoke up when others didn't. Just wanted to say, thanks. Harold nodded. You keep showing up. That's thanks enough. The kid smiled and walked off, shoulders a bit higher. That was the verdict Harold came for. Not one from the judiciary, but the slow turning of a city's conscience. The verdict was in every whispered thank you, every stranger who dared to meet his eye now instead of looking past him. Later that day, Maya handed him an envelope. Media request. They want you on national morning TV. He didn't even glance at it. I'm not doing this for applause, he said. I'm doing this because silence isn't an option anymore. But silence, it turned out, was still powerful in the right hands. Harold chose to speak not through spectacle, but by building something lasting. Within days, he secured a permit for a community forum at the Savannah Cultural Center. Not a rally, a conversation. And people came. Lawyers, nurses, teachers, veterans. City council members who had once ignored his emails now sat at the folding tables with pens poised. One woman, a librarian, stood up with tears in her eyes and said, I've waited 30 years for someone to say what we all know and still fear saying out loud. Harold looked around the room, full but quiet, listening. The unwritten verdict had been carved out in spaces like this, where no one shouted but every word mattered, where a fat black man in worn boots was no longer seen as a disruption, but as direction. There was no sweeping press conference, no final mic drop moment, just a slow, quiet tide of change. When Officer Daltrey resigned silently without ceremony, it wasn't even front-page news. The department released a statement citing personal reasons. But the city knew. More importantly, the city had seen. And Savannah, for the first time in a long time, felt like it might be becoming what it claimed to be. On a warm Friday evening, Harold returned to River Street. He didn't need to be there. He wasn't staging anything. He just stood at the place it all began. Tourists walked by unaware. Children giggled near the water's edge. And Harold closed his eyes just for a moment. He remembered the shove, the hands, the concrete, but he also remembered what came after. 6 months ago, no one would have believed it. A man like him, broad, dark, unapologetic, standing toe-to-toe with the system, and winning not with fury, but with facts, with vision, with stubborn truth. And now the city had learned to look again, not past him, at him. The trap wasn't in exposing corruption. The trap was forcing the city to reckon with itself and finding that once it looked in the mirror, it couldn't look away. That was the verdict. Not guilty, but necessary. And finally seen. When Harold Jennings first stepped onto River Street that humid afternoon, he was just another face in a city that had long since learned to look away from men like him. To some, he was a problem. To others, invisible. What they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was that the man they dismissed carried with him not just his weight, not just his scars, but a plan rooted in patience, conviction, and truth. His confrontation with the police wasn't a spontaneous moment of outrage. It was a calculated exposure. Every detail from his silent recording to the invitation that proved his right to be there was part of a deeper resistance. One not designed to explode in fury, but to reveal a reality too many refused to acknowledge. What began as a public humiliation became the beginning of public reckoning. The footage of Harold's mistreatment didn't end in outrage alone. It sparked inquiry. It inspired conversations in coffee shops, council chambers, classrooms. The trap he set wasn't meant to harm, it was meant to hold up a mirror, to force Savannah and the country watching to see what it had grown comfortable, ignoring the way dignity is too often denied to those who don't look sound or move the way we expect respectable citizens to. Harold didn't raise his voice. He didn't resist with fists. He stood his ground with stillness, with quiet truth, and with an unshakable sense of who he was, and that more than anything else forced the world around him to shift. His name, once unknown, now whispered across Savannah's communities, spoken with a mixture of admiration and discomfort. His story made it clear he wasn't just another black man harassed by police. He was a mirror, a challenge, a symbol of what happens when the silenced refuse to stay silent any longer. In the weeks and months that followed, change didn't come with headlines and trumpets. It came in ripples. Officer Daltrey's resignation didn't spark celebration. It sparked questions. City leaders, once content with routine, suddenly found their inboxes full. And across the South in towns just like Savannah, people began to wonder how many more Harold Jenningses had gone unseen, unheard, unwelcome. But Harold wasn't looking for fame. He didn't want revenge. He wanted respect. He wanted a world where his son could walk through a city and not worry about what his size, his skin, or his silence might cost him. He wanted streets where justice wasn't reserved for the loudest or the richest, but for the right. The forums he led weren't performances. They were bridges. And while not everyone crossed them, the ones who did left different than they arrived. White residents who had never sat in a room where they were the minority listened. Black residents who had long given up on City Hall found themselves speaking again. And in those rooms, real stories came to life. Painful, powerful, unfiltered. And Harold always, at the center not preaching but listening, guided those conversations with the quiet strength of someone who's endured the fire and emerged with something deeper than anger. Harold's journey reminds us that power doesn't always come in the form of authority or wealth. Sometimes, the most powerful act is simply standing still in the truth and refusing to move. His story teaches us that change doesn't always begin with speeches, it begins with discomfort. With that sting of injustice that won't leave your chest. With the decision to show up again and again, even when the world doesn't make space for you. In a time when division often feels louder than unity, Harold Jennings showed us another way, not through force, but through intention. Not with protest signs, but with presence. And not by demanding the spotlight, but by holding it steady until the right people were finally seen. So what can we take from Harold's story? We learn that silence can be power when it is paired with purpose. That dignity, even when denied, can be reclaimed. That no matter how invisible society tries to make someone truth, always has a way of revealing itself, and when it does, it demands to be reckoned with. We live in a world where too many people are told subtly or explicitly that they don't belong, that their presence is disruptive. But Harold Jennings flipped that narrative. He disrupted a system not with noise, but with facts, not with rage, but with resolve. And in doing so, he reminded us that true justice doesn't need to be loud to be heard. To all watching, you may never find yourself in Harold's shoes. But chances are you will one day find yourself in a room where someone else is being quietly erased. And in that moment, you'll have a choice to look away or to stand up. Let this story be your reminder. Sometimes, the simplest act of courage is refusing to stay seated. Sometimes, the seat that's denied is the one most worth fighting for. And if Harold's story moved you, if it made you feel reflect or even uncomfortable, then do something with it. Share it. Start a conversation. And most importantly, subscribe to this channel so we can continue telling stories that matter. Because voices like Harold's deserve to echo. Not just today, but for every day someone is told they're not enough. And we'll be here to make sure they're never forgotten.